Hi again. Today's book is By Water Beneath the Walls by Ben Milligan, and it's the story of the evolution of the United States Navy SEAL teams. Ben Milligan served in the SEALs initially in Team 4 and then later Team 5. And he deployed overseas, and after a tour in Iraq, he came home and his grandmother asked him, he mentioned a little bit about the operations they were doing, which obviously were in ground-based operations, and she said, well, you're in the Navy, why is the Navy fighting on land in a desert? And this book really is his answer to how that came about from the earliest days in World War II to really how the SEAL teams as such were stood up. The title of the book refers to an assault on a fortress in ancient times from the water, and it's fully explained in the introduction to the book. So as I mentioned, the whole thing starts in World War II, and really the first inklings of special forces in the United States were in the United States Marines. Now, how the book is constructed, he initially was just going to talk about the evolution of the SEALs, but he realized that couldn't be done in isolation. It had to be in the context of all the other services and the units that were stood up, what happened and why. So the US Marines, looking to the UK and seeing the commandos, decided to set up their own, and they gave the job to an officer called Evans Carlson, who was a Sinophile. He had served in China and was very enamoured of the Chinese methods of guerrilla warfare. So he recruited a unit which were called the US Marine Raiders, and their motto was Gung Ho. He was offered the opportunity to come over to the UK with his guys and go through the commando course at Aknakari, but he disdained this and said, or was of the opinion that he'd learnt everything he needed from the Chinese. However, if you think about it, I very much doubt that the Chinese were doing amphibious assaults, particularly of the type that were going to be needed, whereas the commando course was based around that. It was specifically waterborne raids on the enemy coasts and hinterlands. So he turned that down, and eventually the Raiders were disbanded in 1944, mainly because, and pretty good reason, the US Marines were of the opinion that they were in fact a special force themselves, and they didn't need an elite unit within it. And looking at some of the operations the Raiders did, they were eclipsed in many ways by what the regular Marine units were doing. So, and in many ways that opinion has held until modern times. Next, the book discusses the Rangers, and this was put together by an officer called William O. Darby, and his name is still heavily linked to the Rangers. And he recruited the 1st Ranger Regiment, and they did go to Achnacarry, and in some ways it was quite an awakening for many of them. They hadn't realised the training was going to be so arduous, but they rose to the occasion and did really well. They carried out several raids in North Africa and Italy, but at Cisterna they were misused to try to capture a large town, and the 1st, 3rd and 4th battalions were severely depleted with heavy losses, and they never really recovered from the setback. Later, the 2nd and the 5th battalions did make a good account of themselves, D-Day and so on, particularly the 2nd with the famous ascent to Point de Hoc, the cliff climb, which led to the famous motto, Rangers lead the way. But the Rangers were disbanded at the end of Second World War. There were other units, many other units. Many years ago there was a book called Commandos and Rangers of World War II by James Ladd, and I bought it. And just in the British and Commonwealth units, it was a plethora of acronyms of units which some had a very brief life, some led to modern day formations and so on, but there were so many. And similarly with America, there were quite a few Medals, Marauders and things like this. One of the things about the book is it's full of characters, and one character which I can't fail to mention is a gentleman called Draper Kaufman. Now, before World War II, in the 30s, he joined the United States Navy as an officer cadet, went to Annapolis, but failed due to several factors, including poor eyesight. When the war in Europe was kicking off, he went to France and volunteered to be an ambulance driver and in the front line, and took part in many hairy rescues of wounded soldiers, so much so he was awarded the Croix de Guerre. He was captured by the Germans during the Blitzkrieg, and he, being an American, was given the option of being repatriated under the condition he agreed to never take up arms against the German Reich again. But he promptly broke that by going to England and joining the Royal Navy. And at a very early stage, the Blitz had kicked off, and he saw a bomb disposal team in action defusing a large bomb, and he realised he'd found his calling and volunteered for that, and very successfully managed to defeat numerous bombs and mines, and was awarded a decoration. He was then approached by the United States Navy. This was just before they came into the war. They saw his potential, and it filled a gap they needed, and the Royal Navy let him go, and he went back home to the United States and started a bomb disposal / demolition entity within the United States Navy. And this led to him starting a school at Fort Pierce in Florida, where he started training his personnel. And they weren't just Navy personnel. He was given quite a few guys from the Army engineers who were already trained in boat handling and demolitions. At the same time, the Scout Raiders were being stood up by an officer called Robert Halperin, or Buck Halperin. I don't really have time to go into their story, but that was quite a prestigious outfit. And one of the things they had was a physical conditioning program, which had been devised by top American football players and coaches. And it was an 8-week program to get the guys fit. Draper Kaufman saw this because they were training at Fort Pierce also at the time, but he didn't have that much time, so he worked on compressing the 8-week arduous syllabus into 5 days, and it was intensive, very little sleep, etc. And it became known as Hell Week, and it's still a fixture. It's still the start of the pipeline to become a Navy SEAL to this day. And Draper Kaufman, even though he wasn't a top physical specimen by any means, submitted himself to Hell Week and passed it. And the unit that he created there was the Navy Combat Demolition Unit. And their exploits were famed on D-Day. And that's what I'll talk about now. So I will guess that most of you saw Saving Private Ryan, and veterans who were at D-Day or Omaha Beach agree that it was a very, very accurate depiction. Well, one of the things about D-Day was the defences that the Germans had spent years employing on the beach and in the waterline to defend the French coast, or right round from Scandinavia almost right round to Spain, the Atlantic Wall. And Rommel had a big input to it, and it was notably defence in depth. And I'll just read some of the notes on it from the book. There was, as I say, defence in depth, so it was at least 4 separate cordons of obstacles. The first belt, 7 feet high and 10 feet wide, the Belgian Gate, was shaped like a prison door and buttressed in the rear by a pointed tangle of crossbeams. Intended to sink its anchor the harder it was pushed. Hardly a necessity considering its weight of 3,000 pounds. And these were not quite next to each other, slight gap in the middle. This was to defeat landing craft and tanks. Further up the beach consisted of a line of wooden stakes, each twice as wide as a man and almost twice as tall. This second belt of defence was a veritable forest whose trees were topped with iron spikes called thorns, designed to eviscerate the guts of a landing craft. Beyond these, the third belt of defence employed an obstacle made from 2 beams joined together, one set straight down into the sand, the other diagonally towards the ocean, shaped like an upside down check mark or tick. This innocuous looking contraption had a purpose that was as sinister as those that preceded it. In this case, it was to act as a ramp that could flip a landing craft and disgorge its passengers at the critical moment of vulnerability. If by some miracle a landing craft did manage to thread its way up to the last belt of defences, that is the one furthest from the water, there still remained one final set of obstacles, meant not for men or boats, but for the one weapon the Germans both loved and feared more than any other, the tank. To stop these, they had assembled a legion of what were known as Czechoslovakian hedgehogs, 4.5-foot high knucklebones that looked like toy jacks, or calthrops we'd say. 4.5-foot high, each welded from 3 separate lengths of angle iron, then planted in concrete, often weighing more than 500 pounds. Taken individually, no single obstacle on Hitler's Atlantic wall was insurmountable. But in order to make them truly impassable, the German defenders had relied on 3 further deterrents. First, they topped every type of the aforementioned obstacles with anti-tank telemines, and millions of them, and then added millions more improvised versions made from artillery shells. Now, formidable obstacle, particularly with the tide. But in the military, an obstacle is not an obstacle unless it's covered by fire. And these were well covered by fire from the cliffs. There were nests of MG42 machine guns, very, very effective machine guns, interlocking arcs of fire. There were mortars, and there were the fearsome 88mm artillery used in the ground role. So absolutely formidable defensive system. And whereas the infantry fought to make their way up the beach, find a little bit of cover, consolidate, and start taking out the enemy positions, the naval combat demolition units had very, very difficult and intricate tasks to perform to defeat, firstly, the explosives on these obstacles, then to plant their own explosive charges and blow gaps in them. These were called gap assault parties, and to make the way for the landing craft and then the tanks. And one of the things that they did was to have the fuses. They would be carrying pounds and pounds of explosive, but the fuses would be carried on the helmets, and they would be wrapped in condoms to seal them from the seawater. And Mr. Milligan makes the very poignant point that in many cases that was the only use these young men had for a condom, because they were killed as virgins. So that chapter absolutely sparks the imagination of the capabilities of these chaps and the difficulty and the bravery. Of that unit. So much so that their casualty rate was 5 times higher than the charge of the Light Brigade. They were given a Presidential Unit citation. Their counterpart in the Pacific, I mentioned Bud Halperin. He trained the UDTs, the underwater demolition teams, and they continued the training on Hawaii before deploying into the Pacific Theatre. And this was the famous US Marine island hopping campaign, where they would seize islands that could serve as air bases, defeat them of the entrenched Japanese defenders who fought to the death, many cases to the last man. Tremendous campaign. Then use the airbase then to go to the next suitable island. One of the problems was these Pacific islands were usually surrounded by a coral reef, which then produced a lagoon between the reef and the island itself. And this was a natural barrier, a natural obstacle. So the underwater demolition team's job was to cross the reef, then swim to the beach, carrying out what's called hydrographic reconnaissance, which is taking soundings so you know the depth, taking samples so you know what kind of vehicles the beach will hold, and charting gun positions, patrol formations, times, sentries, etc., etc. And these guys, as I mentioned, they were awesomely fit from this 8-week conditioning. Obviously, their job in the water required them to be fit. But they deployed ashore wearing swim trunks, fins, wearing a diving mask, carrying a slate with which to write the measurements on, a K-bar knife, and in many cases they would, with black grease, put stripes across the body so they could actually use the body to measure. And they would be really in amongst the sentries, making these notes, keeping quiet, and so on. But then in many cases they would actually join the assault and go further and take part in some raids and so on. So they kind of adapted a dual role. So at the end of World War II, the only surviving special unit was the UDTs. The Rangers had been disbanded. The US Marine Raiders had been disbanded also. Then the book goes into a campaign that I wasn't even aware of. It was in China, where they were fighting. This was still World War II. They were fighting to distract the Japanese, to get them to concentrate on the Chinese problem, to allow the Pacific War to conclude with the actual surrender of Japan. And another one of these amazing characters, Mary Miles, although he was a man, he actually was a destroyer captain, but he became the leader of a 100,000 man Chinese army. It's an absolutely astounding story, and full of intrigue. He became very, very friendly with the Chiang Kai-shek's head of intelligence, and really it was supposed to be the OSS's job to do this, but this intelligence supremo liked Captain Miles, and he got the job. And it's an absolutely fascinating episode, and I'd say it's one that's little known. Book also covers Korea, and here again another one of these amazing people, Martin Watson. And just read the book and your mind will be blown just by his story alone. It would make a movie, except you wouldn't believe it. There were movies made. For example, there was a movie made of Derby's Rangers starring James Garner, who also starred in a film I remember where he was a UDT diver. Pretty good, but quite a lot of factual errors in these films. But Martin Watson's story would make a tremendous film. Then, in the early 60s, this SEAL teams were activated as an offshoot or as a brother unit to the UDTs, and they were trained on the same program. So the basic training is BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition / SEAL, to this day. And the UDTs became the swimmer delivery teams, and the SEALs were the other part of the equation. And there were two major SEAL teams, teams 1 and 2. They were activated. And then along came the Vietnam War, and they found fame there because they were arguably the most effective of the special forces. There were reasons for this, the way they pre-deployed, their build-up training, and the fact that they deployed as a unit, a cohesive unit, where some of the others deployed in a rotational piecemeal thing. So you were arriving in country and going on ops with people you'd never met before. Whether it was the SEALs, many of whom had been to Ranger School, which was the repository of the knowledge gained in World War II by the Rangers, was passed on in Ranger School, although there was no Ranger units at the time. They weren't reactivated until 1974. Amongst the many things of note is the story of Mike Thornton, who gained the Congressional Medal of Honor as a SEAL by rescuing Tommy Norris, who was also a Medal of Honor winner. An absolutely unique event. Story is mind-blowing. Mike Thornton became a plank owner in SEAL Team 6, and Tommy Norris likewise in the FBI hostage rescue team. So the crucible of the SEALs was Vietnam, and it's led to their prominence to this day. Many senior officers either resented the fact that special units took some of their best guys, or they were in a position to misuse those units, such as what happened to the Rangers. And that's been a perpetual problem in all nations' special operations forces. It seems obvious now of the need for those type of forces, a repository of specialized skills that are just not needed in the wider army. In the infantry, for example, don't generally need to be able to perform military free-fall insertions. They don't need to be able to perform sub-aqua missions. They don't need to be able to infiltrate in quite the same way. They don't need to be able to use various forms of specialized equipment. And it just seems obvious now, but it was a very, very hard-won effort to get to the situation we are now. The book relies on numerous primary sources. It was 10 years in the research. The archives, talking to people who were there, reading the diaries and journals of some of these prominent guys, talking to their family members, getting everything verified, and putting it all together. A tremendous work. Many of the stories never been heard before. Some of the actions had to be unearthed from archives that have never been touched. And really the book is a tremendous tribute to the heroism and endurance of the greatest generation and their successors. And I really, really recommend that you read it. It's quite a long book. I read it on Kindle. You never really get to know the size of it, but it seems a lengthy book, but it's absolutely fascinating, chock full of information and full of amazing characters doing amazing things. And it certainly is deserves a place on everyone's military history library shelf.